Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Desk, our regular First Things podcast. This is Rusty Reno, and I am at the Editor's Desk. And joining me is Daniel McCarthy, editor of Modern Age and author of a review in the August-September issue, a review of Yoram Hazony's book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, in combination with Matthew Continetti's book, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. And we gave the title of this review The Right, as Dan gives us a tour of the various options facing the American right in the early decades of the 21st century. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rusty. It's a delight to be here.
Matthew Continetti, you do a very fine job giving the reader a sense of what these two books are about. Continetti's is more of a straightforward history, it seems. Hazony's is a more ambitious, both surveying historical figures and laying out a more theoretical approach. So what is Continetti's project in this book?
Yeah, both of these books are very ambitious. So Matthew Continetti's The Right covers a full century of both political and intellectual conservatism, going from the 1920s until basically the beginning of the Joe Biden administration. And his argument is that there's something of a cycle or a circuit that is completed during that century. The American right of the Calvin Coolidge era was somewhat protectionist. It was somewhat hands-off in terms of its foreign policy engagements. And it was rather skeptical of free trade. It was in favor of tariffs and a certain degree of protection for American industry. And so these are themes that have come back into the Republican Party since Donald Trump emerged as the party's leader. And one of the sort of implications of Continetti's narrative, and there's so much that he tries to pack into this book of just 500 pages, that he has to go rather breezily through a lot of his material. But one of the sort of overarching narratives that emerges is the idea that the attempt to broaden the mind of the right over the course of the last 100 years to introduce certain what might be considered cosmopolitan or liberal themes, to have a right that wanted to be more engaged in the world, both in terms of foreign policy and in terms of trade and immigration, that this project basically was unsuccessful. And I think Continetti, he is someone who has a familial connection and a professional connection to the neoconservatism that had been prominent during the George W. Bush years and that it first emerged on the right really in the late 60s and early 1970s. Continetti is married into the Kristol family, whose patriarch, Irving Kristol, was the sort of self-identified godfather of neoconservatism. Continetti got his professional start at the Weekly Standard, which was the magazine founded and run by Bill Kristol. So Continetti, I think, has a certain familial connection and personal connection to the neoconservative project. And there's a certain amount of pessimism, I think, that comes through in his book as a result of the failure of the neoconservative project over the last 20 years.
But you report that one way that Continetti characterizes this 100 years is this tension between a populist impulse on the American right and what he thinks is the better impulse on the American right. How does that come out in the book?
Populism relates to some of the issues I mentioned earlier, focusing on America itself as opposed to a integration of a world system with a grand kind of philosophical or ideological project, in particular, a project that I think many of us would call neoliberalism, but it also has many parallels with neoconservatism. Continetti sees the Republican Party of the 1920s as being quite populist. Basically what happens is that after the Great Depression, the Republican Party loses its electoral mojo. And at the same time, Continetti portrays a picture of conservative intellectuals as also being out of touch with the American public. And I don't agree with him on some of his assessments here, but he, for example, is quite critical of the conservatives who were supporting Senator Joseph McCarthy in his, identification of communist subversion as a major threat to the United States in the 1950s. Continetti tends to look at the conservative movement, both intellectually and politically, of the early post-war era in the 1950s and 1960s as largely unsuccessful. The fact that Barry Goldwater never becomes president is one index of that. The fact that Robert A. Taft, who was Mr. Republican in the 1950s and was seen as the more conservative alternative to Dwight Eisenhower, the fact that he never even gets the Republican nomination for president is another indication of the sort of failure of the post-war right in Continetti's view. And philosophically as well, you have a number of very interesting thinkers like Wilmore Kendall and James Burnham appearing in the pages of National Review early on, and others as well, including William F. Buckley himself. But Continetti sees them all as investing too much in some of the fringe matters of the Cold War, things like supporting Senator McCarthy. And also, he takes a conventional view of the National Review's commitment to defending the South in the midst of the era of segregation. And NR was never, a fire-breathing segregationist publication, but it was a publication which made conventional conservative arguments against democracy, but applied that to Black voting rights in the South during the Jim Crow era. And of course, that creates, a number of, uncomfortable discussions for conservatives today.
I'm sympathetic with your thinking here. I mean, to say that Richard Weaver or James Burnham or whomever was unsuccessful or that a certain kind of conservatism was unsuccessful because it didn't win the Republican nomination is like saying the New Left was unsuccessful because, George McGovern got slaughtered by Richard Nixon in 1972. But it's transparently the case that the ideas of the New Left have been massively influential over the last 50 years of American society. And
that's right. Although Continetti's evaluation of this is to the extent that the more populist and more nationalist elements of the intellectual right wound up triumphing in the end over the course of 100 years. I think he sees that as a rather bad thing. So even to the extent that the intellectual right does succeed, it succeeds in the ways that he thinks are generally detrimental and generally are not what he wants to see prevail.